Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Today I'm presenting the second half of my interview of Mark Sleboda. In this episode, Mark and I discuss the recent interview of Russian President Vladimir Putin by Financial Times correspondent Lionel Barber. Unfortunately, President Putin does not do interviews in English, and the videos have subtitles rather than dubbed over English, so I will read from a translation of Putin's words. But let's begin with the introduction to the video by the Financial Times correspondent.
Morning in Red Square in Moscow. We've just finished a 90-minute interview with President Vladimir Putin in the heart of the Kremlin. Mr. Putin spoke expansively on foreign affairs. He held out the prospect, possibly, of a breakthrough in UK-Russian relations. He spoke about the risk of an uncontrolled arms race in the absence of arms control agreements with the United States. He denied that Russia was getting too close to China and the fact that he'd taken a risk in intervening militarily in Syria, and he felt it had paid off because Russia was back at the top table. And finally, in a crescendo of this fascinating conversation, he spoke about the end of the liberal idea.
Let's skip forward to the question that really spurred President Putin to discuss globalization and the liberal idea.
Mr. President, you're a student of history. You've had many hours of conversations with Henry Kissinger. You've almost certainly read his book, World Order. With Mr. Trump, we're seeing something new, something much more transactional. He is very critical of alliances and allies in Europe. Is this something that is to Russia's advantage?
Спросите лучше, что выгодно для Америки в данном случае. Но господин Трамп, он же ведь не...
It would be better to ask what would be to America's advantage in this case. Mr. Trump is not a career politician. He has a distinct world outlook and vision of U.S. national interests. I do not accept many of his methods when it comes to addressing problems, but do you know what I think? I think that he is a talented person. He knows very well what his voters expect from him. You and I are talking ahead of the G20 meeting. It is an economic forum, and it will undoubtedly have discussions on globalization, global trade, and international finance. Has anyone ever given a thought to who actually benefited and what benefits were gained from globalization, the development of which we've been observing and participating in over the past 25 years since the 1990s? China has made use of globalization, in particular to pull millions of Chinese out of poverty. What happened in the United States, and how did it happen? In the United States, the leading U.S. companies, their managers, shareholders, and partners made use of these benefits. The middle class in the United States has not benefited from globalization. It was left out when this pie was divided up. The Trump team sensed this very keenly and clearly, and they used this in the election campaign. That is where you should look for reasons behind Trump's victory rather than in any alleged foreign interference. This is what we should be talking about here, including when it comes to the global economy. I believe this may explain his seemingly extravagant economic decisions and even his relations with his partners and allies. He believes that the distribution of resources and the benefits of globalization in the past decade was unfair to the United States. I'm not going to discuss whether it was fair or not, and I will not say if what he is doing is right or wrong. I would like to understand his motives, which is what you asked me about. Maybe this could explain his unusual behavior.
I definitely want to come back to the Russian economy, but what you've said is absolutely fascinating. Here you are, the President of Russia, defending globalization, along with President Xi, whereas Mr. Trump is attacking globalization and talking about America first. How do you explain this paradox?
Я не думаю, что парадоксом является то, что он хочет, чтобы Америка
I don't
была
think that
первой.
his desire to make America first is a paradox. I want Russia to be first, and that is not perceived as a paradox. There's nothing unusual there. As for the fact that he is attacking some manifestations of globalization, I made that point earlier. He seems to believe that the results of globalization could have been much better for the United States than they are. These globalization results are not producing the desired effect for the United States, and he is beginning this campaign against certain elements of globalization. This concerns everyone, primarily major participants in the system of international economic collaboration, including allies. That was an excerpt from the Financial Times interview of Russian President Putin recently. To discuss this, I spoke with international affairs and security analyst Mark Sleboda, who is based in Moscow. In his interview with the Financial Times, where he said that the liberal idea has become obsolete, it has come in conflict with the interests of the overwhelming majority of the population. And I think to some extent that explains Trump's election in the first place. Maybe you can comment on that, and I think we'd have to start with what does Putin mean when he uses the word liberal, because over here we use that for pretty much everything.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about first. So this was a great interview. If you haven't read it, the Financial Times, I think they've put it back behind a firewall. But I think you can actually watch the whole thing now, which you couldn't do before on YouTube. And the transcript might be out there. It's an hour-and-a-half interview. It's some 28 word pages. It is worth reading. And give the Financial Times credit, for which they've actually been condemned by many of the more anti-Russian forces in the Western media. They actually conducted a fairly level interview with Putin, where they asked him serious questions, particularly about foreign policy, and his greater worldview, and he answered them honestly and at length and in detail. So it was a fabulous interview, and it lets us get more inside the head of, of course, one of the biggest, most important leaders in the world today, which, give them credit for that, even if they then took out an editorial, trying to quite qualifiedly rebuke back everything he said in the interview, or at least, the points they made a big deal out of. I think I was surprised at what a good interview it was. Mm-hmm. So read it and decide for yourself, of course. And he talked about a lot of things: foreign policy, Russian relations with China, the situation, the conflict in Syria, this Skripals affair with the United Kingdom, and relations between the UK. So it was only near the end of the interview when they asked him a question, and it was really kind of a mistaken question on their part, where they asked him that, they pointed out what they call this spread of nationalist populism that has overtaken the U.S. Right. With Trump, the UK with Brexit, the EU, with the new Italian coalition government, which overthrew the centrist parties, in France with Marine Le Pen gaining in the polls, with Germany, with Merkel looking weaker than ever, and the rise of the Alternative for Germany, with Viktor Orban, and a problematic Polish government. They say, how long until this hits Russia, until you are affected by this? And he points out, well, in a way, the Western media, at least, is trying to depict Putin as the architect of all of this, whether you want to call it alt-right or far-right or nationalist populist forces. Of course, none of this is farther from the truth. But as Putin points out, this is a problem resulting from within Western countries because of the contradictions that have come of where the liberal idea, liberalism, the political philosophy, has in my form, mutated into. He's not talking about classical liberalism here. He's talking about what I like to call, at least, postmodern liberalism, what liberalism has become in the past 20 years. Because while he's saying this, keep in mind that just back in 2014, in an interview in Russia, to the Russian press, Putin said, "I am a liberal, and I follow the liberal idea." And that might take you aback, and you say, "Well, I thought Putin was a far right conservative / Marxist / whatever you want to identify as evil." But that's actually not that irreconcilable. First of all, people's politics change, and Putin certainly has. When Putin took office in the year 2000, he was pretty close to a classical liberal, actually. He has morphed because of what Russia has needed, what the Russian people want, and what the West, particularly the United States, has done, in forcing, his hand and Russia into the position that it has. Putin is an organic process. He evolves, geopolitically and politically, like all the rest of us. What he doesn't mean, he is not talking here about neoliberalism, the economic, or what we often identify as neoliberalism today. And he's not talking about the liberal world order here. He might, and I believe he does, have problems with both of those things, particularly the latter to some degree, right? But he's talking here about the liberal idea, and I believe it's quite clear what he's talking about: postmodern liberalism. He's not talking here particularly about the liberal world order, which of course is not very liberal. It isn't really a world order. It's a U.S.-led hegemony, or more likely a suzerainty, but in actual power definitions. But he's not talking about that here. He brings up specifically this problem with mass migration, the influx of refugees and immigrants, and the policies of multiculturalism, which, let's not forget, Angela Merkel herself, not too many years ago, declared that the policies of multiculti, as it's called in Germany, have utterly failed. All right, that was Angela Merkel. That wasn't too long ago when she said that. And every U.S. president, from Barack Obama, back to Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, every American president has admitted, as Barack Obama did, that our immigration policy is broken. That the U.S. immigration, just no one has any idea, and I'm not sure there are any clear ideas on how to solve it. Certainly, right. There seems to be a great deal of political fighting over it in the United States. A lot of I believe, extremist posturing on both sides. But I haven't heard anyone put together any serious policies that might actually begin to tackle it, which is a tragedy for America. But so he talks about migration, multiculturalism, particularly what it's doing to European politics, this reaction to it, and he also specifically talks about this promotion of kind of postmodern identity politics, I would call it, this promotion of LGBT plus whatever as an ideology, which I don't think is any great surprise, is not very popular to Putin, or it's not very popular in Russia, or it should be said, most of the rest of the world outside of the West, or even more particularly the U.S. and some parts of the EU. Although I think it's important to remember that not even in the U.S. and the EU are those, the idea that those are values that should be promoted societally ubiquitous. That there is a great deal of resistance, and that exactly is this driver, one of the drivers, at least, of this, shall we say, nationalist populism, as is often decried in the press. And personally, I have no problem with the use of the term nationalist populism to define that phenomenon, as long as we acknowledge that the opposite side of that is what's driving it, and it's elitist globalism. And as long as we're happy to identify the other side of that, then we can talk critically about both sides of, and the rights and wrongs or at least the pluses and minuses of that. But Putin in this, he's talking about this postmodern liberal idea, and he says it's become obsolete, particularly because of this counter reaction to it, and particularly he points out, the people who have lost out of globalization in the U.S. and the EU, and that's not to say that people haven't lost out from globalization in Russia too. It was much more in the 90s that they suffered from it under liberalism than they do now. But he specifically says then, though, which is not being reported, he qualifies what he said there. It seems to me that purely liberal or purely traditional ideas, one side or the other, he's posing liberal versus traditional, have never existed. Probably they did exist once in the history of humankind, but everything very quickly ends in a deadlock if there is no diversity. He's talking about diversity of political views, of political philosophy. Everything starts to become extreme one way or another. Well, yeah, that sounds like U.S. politics to me. Yeah, at least when it comes to the culture and the identity wars. Various ideas and various opinions should have a chance to exist and manifest themselves. But at the same time, interests of the general public, those millions of people and their lives, should never be forgotten, i.e. this gulf between a globalized elite and the working class people who have lost out from globalization across the West. That is something that should not be overlooked. Then it seems to me we should be able to avoid major political upheavals and troubles. This applies to the liberal idea as well. It does not mean that it must be immediately destroyed, liberalism. The point of view, this position should also be treated with respect, right? They simply can't dictate anything to anyone, just like they have been attempting to do over the recent decades. Diktat could be seen everywhere, both in the media and in real life. It is deemed unbecoming even to mention some topics. But why? So what he's saying is that liberal ideas are important, right? And he says the liberal idea cannot be destroyed either. It has the right to exist, and it should even be supported in some things. But you should not think it has the right to be the absolute dominating factor. That is the point. He's talking about what has become the cultural hegemony of a particular strain of postmodern liberalism. And he is not saying that classical liberalism, I'm not a big fan of actually that idea myself, but, and he's not talking about leftism. In Russia, leftism and liberalism are more properly, I think, separated into quite two different categories. While Russia under Putin practices a very tight fiscal policy with big reserves, paying off all the national debt, which might be termed neoliberal, it also has, at least a semi-functioning system of free healthcare and free higher education. Those aren't exactly neoliberal policies as we define them. And in Russia, Putin is still, by many measures, a liberal. I mean, according to the majority of the Russian population and the other Russian political forces, if Putin disappeared tomorrow, it would either be the communists, and those who follow his, his path anyway. It would be the communists or the nationalists who would take power, and possibly a combination of both, as the communists have become more nationalists, and the nationalists, I'm talking the soft nationalists, not the ethnic nationalists, but like the Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, that has become more leftist, or leftish, shall I say, anyway. So, in Russia, the silent majority is moderately social conservative and moderately economically leftish, I would say, statist, right? De Gaullist, if you want to call it that. That is the silent Russian majority, and that is what Vladimir Putin's politics have become. But if you go by modern Western standards, the standards that have become hegemonic with this postmodern liberalism, then you might identify Putin as far right, or a harsh conservative. Everything, there is no more liberal and conservative. Have you noticed that? There is liberal and there is illiberal. That is the new word, illiberal or authoritarian. But it's like the word conservative, something that by Western standards, Putin is a moderate conservative of 15 years ago. That identifies his politics in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah. Well, I thought this was what
maybe not. Maybe not an American conservative. I take that back.
No.
A European conservative of 15 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Everything has moved so far to the right in this country, but what really intrigued me here was talking about the obsolescence of liberalism vis-a-vis multiculturalism and the problem of immigration, particularly migrants from countries that have been destroyed by the U.S. in one way or another. And then contrasting that to globalization, in which the benefits of globalization, as he puts it, have gone to countries like China and to some extent Russia, but have not gone to the middle class in America. That America has not really benefited from the globalization that their government has pushed so assiduously, over the last several decades. That has all gone to the elites, to the 1%.
Sure, I mean, and that's quantitatively provable, right? I mean, you can see where the profits, as the GDP and Wall Street continues to grow enormously over the last 20 years, have gone, or especially since the global crisis created by the U.S. in 2008 with the real estate market bubble, the wealth has gone into the hands of a 1%, particularly in the United States, but not only in Russia as well. It's not quite as extreme that way, but this is where the U.S. goes economically, the world unfortunately still follows, it's affected the U.S. And I'm sorry, it wasn't Putin that got Trump elected in 2016. It was disenfranchised, or shall we say, economically left behind Rust Belt workers in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and elsewhere, whom elected Trump not because they think he necessarily could do anything to improve the economic situation for them, and I don't believe he's going to bring their jobs back. Right? It's not easy to reverse time that way, but because at least he addressed that they had problems and they had been left behind, rather than this fiction that everyone has benefited from globalization. No, a cosmopolitan, educated, largely elite, tech-focused portion of the population has benefited, but certainly, the old blue-collar working class has suffered, and is you might say that's inevitable. That's the way the world is going. But there are specific policies, economic policies, followed by presidents and legislatures on both sides of the aisle, going back decades, all the way back even to Bretton Woods, that have created that that situation. It is not inevitable. It might be inevitable now, but it was created that way. And Trump at least addressed their problems and say they have been dealt a raw deal. And that's why many people voted for him. Not so much for him, but against the Hillary Clinton elite, be that Democratic or Republican, that are seen as, the harbingers of globalization, which has had winners, both in the U.S. and globally, and has had losers. And Trump has recognized that, and globalization has both economic and social and cultural aspects. And, in Europe in particular, they're reacting to both, right? And immigration and, other, pushed liberal, postmodern liberal values now have come out in that. And, it's not just something Putin is talking about, but of course it became it is somehow much worse and much more of an existential shock when Putin is saying it, when our own politicians or our own academics are saying this. I was just reading, just back in Foreign Affairs, an article in February. The future of the liberal order is conservative. This was in February, right? This was a few months before Putin spoke. I mean, all you have to do is, if you're, familiar with the liberal, people are recognizing that, that liberalism, that whatever you want to call it, this, particularly in Europe, this technocratic, postmodern ruling elite, there is a democracy deficit. They've got an ideology of a supra-state with postmodern liberal values that they're pushing on European populations, and part of that is as a nation deconstruction project, which is what the EU has become. And people, not only in the UK, but in Spain and France and elsewhere, and certainly in Hungary and Poland and other Eastern European countries, are acting negatively to that. And it's not Putin who caused this, but Putin is in some ways speaking a truth. That is being unrecognized. Now, don't think that Putin, of course, is trying to exploit this geopolitically. He is identifying himself. He's very smart that way, psychologically and politically, with forces that are seen as disruptive in the EU, i.e. Orban and Salvini and Marine Le Pen and others, but are, certainly homegrown forces with their own, domestic, constituents and representation, but also, of course, with Donald Trump, and that is a form of manipulation. But at the same time, it's also where Putin has moved himself, or I'm not so sure how much maybe Putin has moved, but the West has become perhaps moved even farther. In this direction, and then I would say it's economically to the right, or in a neoliberal direction, and socially in a postmodern liberal, and I divorce that from leftism, direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The leftism is more involved with class rather than cultural changes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. That was international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda speaking to me from Moscow. I think we can all agree with President Putin that the benefits of globalization have not helped the middle class in the United States, and certainly haven't lifted anyone out of poverty. Our system funnels all the benefits to the top 1%, and unfortunately nothing Trump is doing is addressing that problem, and he and his Republican colleagues are actively making things worse. If we're to correct this situation, we need a president and a Congress who are firmly committed to the redistribution of wealth in this country, not just some people who happen to belong to the Democratic Party. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests, and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you're listening. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.